Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode of the award winning Everything Compliance. Today we have the quartet of Matt Kelly, Karen Moore, Karen Woody, and occasionally Jonathan Marks, and he's back. Mr. Armstrong is traveling today, so we're going to go east to west with Matt Kelly, Karen Moore, Karen Woody, and I can't believe you're the furthest west, Jonathan Marks. So, Matt, what's in your supply chain this week?
Not a pager, not a
But
walkie-talkie. But nonetheless, I did want to talk today about these supply chain stability issues that were really brought into stunning relief when apparently Israel intelligence services did this sneak attack against Hezbollah by detonating 3,000 or so pagers across Lebanon and parts, I think, of Syria as well. But 3,000 pagers used by Hezbollah all at once, killing 12 people, injuring 2,800, and then the next day detonating a whole bunch of walkie-talkies that Hezbollah had then decided to default to use because those also had been booby-trapped. And this is just a stunning story. I am not going to comment on the morality of waging an attack like this or the geopolitical tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, which have been going on for decades and are beyond my expertise. But all of that aside, it's still this moment, this episode is quite a lesson about supply chain risks for companies. Not necessarily that I think all companies are at risk of somebody infiltrating and sabotaging your physical goods that you use to try and blow up your company. But think about it. You think about the modern supply chain and how long and convoluted it is, and all of the ways that things can go wrong in that chain. Whether somebody is doing it deliberately, which seems to be what happened here with the pager attack, or inadvertently, where somebody outsources something to a subcontractor they don't know, they don't tell you, you don't detect a product quality defect or something like that. There's all sorts of ways that what we saw with that episode with the beepers can still have some relevant compliance lessons. I sketched out a few of them here. First, I think we should just step back and talk about how people think this pager attack was actually planned. And we should be clear, we don't actually quite know, but the pagers were supposedly made by a Taiwanese manufacturing company called Gold Apollo. Except that company now says it didn't make the pagers. That company only licenses out its manufacturing name to other third parties who then do manufacturing under the Gold Apollo brand. So that has led people to trace this, they think, to a Hungarian company called BAC Consulting, which apparently did the manufacturing, except that's news to the government of Hungary, who says that no such activity was done on Hungarian soil. So we're not entirely clear where were these pagers made, who made them, when did Israeli operatives intercept that and manage to insert explosives and I guess, the detonators into the pagers for 3,000 of them. But somehow this happened. So what kind of questions would a compliance officer want to think about as you're pondering an incident like this? Well, first of all, do you know who your third parties actually are? Because maybe the brand name that impresses you, that you want to do business with, maybe they don't actually make the item or provide the service in question that you're paying for. Maybe they've licensed that name. And as much as I can't believe I'm about to say this, one company that has done this quite well over the years is, in fact, the Trump Organization. Trump Steaks, Trump Airlines, Trump Perfumes, Trump Ties, Trump this, Trump that, none of which Donald Trump ever actually made. So people were really just paying for the affiliation with a well-known brand, but the actual delivery of steaks, ties, perfumes, I think bedspreads, and I don't know, whatever else he's been in, but he never made any of that. And that is kind of sort of the same scenario that we have here, that Gold Apollo apparently had been lending its name to other subcontractors of questionable quality. So do you know in your supply chain how often that happens? Second and related question is, can you do sufficient due diligence on the third party and any potential subcontractors? People might not be surprised to know that as they're looking into this BAC consulting group, the actual documentation for this business is pretty hard to find. There's not much out there. Well, geez, man, that's a total surprise. But you have to think about, can you find articles of incorporation? Can you find shipping documents for prior customers or something like that? Any proof that this third party is who they say they are, or is it subcontracting? Who are those subcontractors? Can they do what they have promised to do? Do they do other things that they don't tell people about? And you might have to do a lot of digging in a lot of different places to establish, I guess we'll call it a chain of custody or a chain of competence for your supply chain. Do you have contract management processes to govern the risk of potential subcontracting without anybody telling you? Are you doing product quality testing on the items that ultimately wind up in your possession? I don't know what Hezbollah may or may not have done to test its pagers, or did they take any apart or anything like that? It would never occur to me to take a pager apart to look for explosives. So I don't know what to say about all of that. But I would actually step back and say, okay, because I bet a lot of listeners are saying that's all fascinating, but really nobody's going to sneak explosives into my stuff and blow me up on purpose. That's fair. But think of it this way. What we are talking about is not that far removed from the crisis at Boeing, where Boeing couldn't manage its product quality issues sufficiently well. Nobody was sabotaging Boeing items specifically, but they have a long and convoluted supply chain, and Boeing's contractors and subcontractors were struggling to put together things at a high degree of product quality, and Boeing either missed it or turned a blind eye to it. But you would want to think about, even if there is inadvertent product quality defects slipping into your supply chain, how are you going to find that? How are you going to govern against it? Where would product quality defects come in? Is it just in sloppy manufacturing because you have a poor subcontractor? Is there some sort of procurement fraud? And by the way, I will die of surprise if there is not procurement fraud somewhere in the mix in this Hezbollah pager story, where somebody paid off somebody else to say, we're going to pay full price and you let us put it together and we'll do it our own way and we'll give you these things back. Like, how could procurement fraud happen at your business? How would you eradicate it or catch it? How would sloppy manufacturing or subcontracting happen at your business? How would you root that out? And then I think the last thing I would just say is that I'm not entirely clear on who would actually be in charge at your company at rooting this stuff out, because it straddles procurement, it straddles manufacturing, it involves legal. All of them would have to work together to think through these sort of supply chain risks. And that all assumes that we're only talking about physical goods. I have not even begun to mention the software supply chain, where there are cybersecurity issues that might sneak in. Now that I'm on my soapbox, that is exactly what the Russians did against SolarWinds and all of its victims, where they snuck into the software supply chain and then put out a flawed product through SolarWinds, which SolarWinds never caught, to all of the users of SolarWinds IT governance software that actually just turned into spyware for Russia. So there's all sorts of ways that actually this broad, nifty idea of supply chain sabotage that we saw in Hamas, which is just something right out of a James Bond movie, strip away the James Bond elements of it, it raises some very important questions about product and supply chain, product quality and supply chain stability that companies do need to think about in our modern, convoluted, globalized age.
Mr. Marks, you have a question or comment for Matt?
No, I mean, my comment is that I'm not surprised. And I would imagine that this happens, a lot. And, it just begs the question with regards to enterprise risk management, both internally and externally, the extended enterprise. I mean, to your point, if you're looking at your third parties and your suppliers, I mean, it's a daunting task to think that you'll be able to cover every single risk.
Yeah.
And so I just think, there's a reason why we do risk assessments. It's to identify the key risks and manage the key risks. But, it doesn't mean that you're managing every risk, and it doesn't mean that you're managing everything that you think that you might know. And so, uh, you know, you bring up some really great points. I just don't. I think there's some expectation out there that every organization is going to cover off on every single risk, and that's clearly not the case, and it's impossible because
That
that
is,
that that would be all you ever did.
I think that's especially true in the software supply chain realm, that, there's just too many ways that there's glitches can wind up in software, either deliberately, inadvertently, through your software you buy, software you get off open source, software you develop. Like, there's no way to do it. And, how many businesses really should invest time thinking about, okay, who might deliberately sabotage the components we use? Well, for almost all companies, probably no one. But how many companies might suffer from some sort of product quality defect thanks to a slipshod supply chain you have? There's possibly quite a few, including examples like Boeing. It's very difficult to know where to draw the line. And, how would you even bring together the right expertise to know the line should be here as opposed to over there? Because this issue cuts across multiple parts of the enterprise that, are really very different.
Karen Moore, do you have a question or comment?
I do both. Just, thinking about all the different third-party risk and procurement processes that I've encountered in different companies, the universe of third parties is enormous. And so is their tendency towards specialized provision of goods and services. So being able to get a handle on that kind of know your third party relationship, not just doing the due diligence, but understanding how they operate, under what kind of culture do they operate, how reliable are they? I mean, I just wonder now if that's become almost unmanageable on the one hand. And then on the other, I'm also wondering whether there isn't or shouldn't be a better move towards, vertical integration of supply chain and bringing some more of those things in-house, some of the critical supplies, so that you have more control and more of a handle. I don't have an answer to that, Matt, but I'm just wondering what next when so many problems arise out of this whole supply chain relationship.
Well, there are two ways you could think about it. First of all, that is exactly the issue that Boeing is grappling with right now. And I feel a bit bad that I keep picking on them, but they are such a good example here. That the problem with them was one of their principal suppliers, Spirit AeroSystems, which builds the fuselage for Boeing planes. Spirit wasn't doing a good job. And so ultimately, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, Boeing made the decision strategically to subcontract out manufacture of its Dreamliner plane. That didn't go well. The Dreamliner has not achieved the goals that Boeing had hoped. And Spirit AeroSystems has become such a problem for them that they are going to acquire Spirit AeroSystems and integrate it pretty much back into their operations. The other point I would make is over in the cyber realm. This is exactly something the Biden administration has talked about when it had its national cybersecurity strategy, basically saying that it wants companies to have a chain of custody for all the software assets you use. Many software assets are now open source, and so somebody just in your IT team, it needs a certain piece of code, they grab it off of GitHub or some other sort of open source thing, and oh yeah, what could go wrong? Everything could go wrong. So you now, for government contractors, they want and expect that you can show where your software came from, where your subcontractor came from, all of the open source stuff you use that's been tested. I think they call it a bill of provenance, about where did this code come from. And that is a good idea, because particularly with software, those supply chains could probably trace on forever. And these are issues that, even though one is manufacturing and one is cybersecurity, and you'd think they are radically different operations in a company, because they are, the risks and what you need to do to govern those risks is essentially the same.
Karen Woody, you have a question or comment?
I do. I'm going to jump in and not maybe play my typical role, which usually is a former defense attorney, but just to be pro-regulator on this. And I know I sort of even mentioned in the chat that this smacks of conflict minerals. And I actually think that's an apt analogy here because that's an impossible thing to trace. In fact, in the first few years of them implementing that, every company was like, we punt, we can't figure this out, which when you think about it, is sort of amazing. Like that whole supply chain, sure, you're not going to get all the way down to this tiny mineral that is sourced maybe out of somewhere in Africa. But it was amazing how little major companies knew just a few steps away down their supply chain. That sort of what surprised me. How do people not know where these things come from? But that doesn't mean you don't put the regulation in place. You don't set, as Matt was talking about, these ideals that, companies and hopefully everyone kind of comes around to. No one had heard of conflict minerals, and now everyone has a conflict minerals report, and are making efforts toward that goal. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think you can think of how hard it will be and how, these can be tiny, impossible pieces of software or code to track down. But if you think on the other end of the spectrum here, you have exactly what the FCPA, AML, every other if you could have just a basic shell company and have that, or not even a shell, but to have someone outsourced to some other maybe Hungarian beeper maker we don't know about, that is exactly the risk we are worried about. So I think there should be some significant regulation, as impossible as maybe it will be to actually come to fruition. I think this is not one we should just sleep on. That's just my thing.
Mr. Marks, do you have some additional thoughts for us?
I keep thinking about going back maybe 15 or 16 years ago, Tom, when you and I were talking about FCPA and we were talking about third parties. And one of the things that seems to get lost in this whole shuffle is if you start looking at programs today, there's the sponsor. Like, who is the sponsor of this relationship?
Yeah.
And those sponsors come and go. And I really do honestly believe that you need a hybrid approach. You need an internal and an external approach to this. You need internal intelligence and external intelligence in order to properly manage your third party risk. And that internal intelligence sometimes is poo-pooed. And a lot of these people come and go, some of them retire, and that institutional knowledge and those relationships go with them. And so I don't know that anyone has really ever identified that as a risk, and maybe we should.
That's an excellent point. That's all I'll say.
So I want to speak
I got one.
on a couple of different angles. Number one, as a reformed, retired, and recovering tort lawyer, you are always responsible for a product that goes out under your name. Product liability says 100% of the time. Now, you may have an indemnity, you may have some other legal rights, but if the product goes out over your name, you're responsible. I don't care. And if somebody gets hurt, they got the right to sue. Number two, this is not just about supply chain. It's also about the sales side, because there was a licensing deal in place. And if you're going to allow a company to put your name on their product, that's a different level of scrutiny. And number three, Matt, you didn't mention the payment angle on this, because the Taiwanese companies reporting has said two things. One, either they were one-time payment out of the Middle East, or all of their payments came out of the Middle East. And if you're dealing with a Hungarian company and you're getting payments, even one out of the Middle East, that's obviously a huge red flag. So there were lots of indicia here, but we had people not looking, burying their head in the sand, or simply not caring. And your premise, though, that this may be one of the ultimate case studies for third-party relationships is absolutely spot on. So thanks for bringing it. All right. Karen Moore, what's on your mind?
Well, I've been thinking about clawback and clawback provisions, and kind of the context for clawback provisions that have been, kind of recently highlighted in some of the DOJ non-prosecution agreements and deferred prosecution agreements. But it first made me think about something we touched on a while back, which is the doctrine of respondeat superior, right? That the company is responsible for the actions of its employees. And I feel like thinking about it, that doctrine underpins a lot of what compliance is doing. We build programs so that people don't get into trouble. We identify risks, we train people, we create conduct expectations, and we pursue those so that the company is responsible for the employee's actions and vice versa. And anytime something really goes wrong, it feels like the first thing a company does is say, not it, go after the individual because we did everything we reasonably could to prevent that individual from engaging in misconduct, and yet they did. So please go after the individual. And why does that lead to clawback? It's kind of related. It's the flip side of it, is that if you as the individual are going to engage in misconduct and the company's going to try and hang you out to dry or identify you, which is important, the company also should not have to pay you incentive compensation or other bonuses. Now, I feel like we've seen a lot of examples where exiting CEOs and other executive officers somehow seem to still manage to hang on to these outrageous amounts of payout. And I've been thinking about, but will not get onto a big ranting soapbox here, about studies which show that CEO salary and compensation is somewhere upwards of 300 times the average worker compensation. And maybe that's neither here nor there. But clawback provisions allow a company to recover or at least not pay out things that have been promised in the event of individual misconduct. And we've talked about it most recently in these deferred prosecution agreements and declinations and other situations where clawback has been encouraged. But there's a broader context when I started looking into it. And the thing that I liked the most is this concept of the faithless servant, which I was certain must have been rooted in English law, because the title is so appealing. But in fact, it comes out of 19th century common law coming out of New York. It's been adopted by a bunch of different states, and it still exists today, which says either by law or by contract, if you've got an employee who's engaged in misconduct, you can withhold salary, you can withhold benefits. They're not entitled. It's almost like an unjust enrichment argument. So this kind of clawback idea has been around for a couple of centuries, but we've seen it more codified more recently. So I mentioned these DPAs, et cetera, and it's really the Department of Justice Criminal Division in its March 2023 revisions to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, and then the pilot program that they put in place the same time regarding compensation incentives and clawbacks, that says to a company, look, if you've had an employee that's been engaged in misconduct and you claw back some of their incentive compensation, you can credit that against the fines and penalties that you need to pay as a result of that misconduct. So we haven't gotten away from the respondeat superior, but it gives the company a little bit of a silver lining, and in fact, a double whammy. You don't pay out the bonus or the other incentive compensation, and you get to deduct it. So it's kind of like a two-time benefit there. But we really see this broadly applied in those provisions to almost any company, but we see it more specifically codified in Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, where under Sarbanes-Oxley, as far back as 2002, said that the SEC can mandate the clawback for CEOs or CFOs if there's a restatement of financial that is a result of misconduct. So only in the question of financial restatement, and only the CEO and CFO. So it's pretty narrowly defined, but it's there. And then we see in 2015 in Dodd-Frank a provision that says that the SEC has to direct the exchanges to require listed companies to adopt formal written clawback policies. But again, it's limited to financial reporting and misconduct. But it wasn't really until January of last year that the SEC actually issued formal rules regarding this enforcement for listed companies. And they provide that for Section 16 officers, so we've got a pretty defined group of people, if there's a restatement due to misconduct related to financial statements, then there needs to be a clawback. And there's a lot more guidance there. So we've kind of got this very, very specific, very narrow group. But Tom, you alerted me to a very interesting study that was published by Harvard Law School in their forum on corporate governance, which, by the way, if people don't subscribe to, is such an excellent source of analysis and information. And they took a look, given that these rules, the SEC rules, came out only at the beginning of last year, and now we've got the 2024 proxy season. They started to look at what effect has this had on companies, and it's been heartening, actually, because they looked at 45 large cap companies, and 80% of them went beyond the SEC requirements, either because they decided to apply these rules to a much broader selection of people than the narrow definitions. They may be defining them as VPs or directors or even further. And or they've expanded, and I think this is the most important, the nature of the underlying misconduct. It could be a clawback due to theft or fraud. It could be a clawback due to violation of the code or policies. So you kind of like to see that in writing. But then I started thinking about, well, what is the effect of these clawback provisions? And they're kind of punitive in the DOJ criminal sense. That after you've engaged in this misconduct, you're going to be punished. They should be viewed as preventative, like we're going to tell all of these people to which our clawback policy applies, or indeed to our, kind of faithless servant concept. Maybe we've included it even contractually with you. So don't engage in misconduct, because you will lose out financially. And then I wondered, is there a downside to any of this? And I just link it back to the soapbox that I often get onto, which is just the dangers and risks of incentive compensation and variable comp that is sometimes out of control in larger companies, where you're tying so much to it, and the chances that there's going to be a clawback are so limited in scope or application that you're almost incentivized into misconduct. Or are you incentivized the other way, or disincentivized to maybe take a calculated risk, or to go into an area that is maybe defensible but questionable because you're so fearful of loss of salary? So more questions than answers here, but clawback is powerful when used properly. The clawbacks that we've seen under the DOJ pilot program so far seem to be pretty small. So we're not talking about really super senior executives. And you got, like, I think in the SAP enforcement action, there was something like $100,000 in clawback on bonuses. That doesn't sound like a Section 16 officer level clawback. If it's in your written policies, I just wonder the extent to which boards are actually going after clawback. We're not going to really see a lot of data there. But I do like that companies at least are thinking about this above and beyond their SEC requirements.
Mr. Marks, do you have a question or comment for Karen Moore?
Yeah, great insights. I'm just thinking to myself, going back to my putting my corporate governance hat on, if I'm looking at comp for executives, it's really 3 levels, right? You have their salary, their bonus, and their incentive comp. So what are they clawing back? Because if my salary is 10 grand and my bonus is 16 million and my incentive comp is 30 million, and you're going to claw back their salary, take it all. And I think there was one airline CEO that actually did that. He played that game, with the structure of his compensation, and said, hey, I'm not taking a salary this year or for the first 6 months. But guess what? People didn't know that his bonus was a gazillion dollars and his incentive comp was a gazillion dollars to the third power. So, I mean, who are we really kidding here? I mean, we really got to get into some of the nitty gritty if they're going to actually make this hurt, because you're going to, I see this all the time. It's a game.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mr. Marks. We saw that a lot during COVID, where CEOs were
Oh,
making a big.
it's no, mister. It's just Marks, just like Jack Reacher is Reacher. I'm just Marks.
Okay, Marks. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I also just don't see it. And again, it maybe isn't always so publicly available, but I just don't see it enforced that much by boards. And picking back on Boeing, we had exiting CEOs that took away their $23-30 million worth of stock options, or we see companies that are failing and doing badly, and yet they're still retaining their benefits. The Harvard data did show, and it's a small sample, but it is large cap companies, so they kind of lead the way, I suppose, that 67% of them not only expanded it in terms of scope and underlying misconduct, but expanded it beyond variable comp and applied it to broader compensation.
Well, that's good. But the last comment, just that I'll move on. But when we look at, and when we do from an investigation perspective, from an investigatory perspective, the first thing we do is we look at compensation, incentive compensation, because it's an enemy of internal control, like you said. What would force why do good people do bad things? And a lot of times it's because of compensation. And so, what causes them to circumvent or override, whatever systems or controls are in place? Comp makes people do crazy things. I once
Oh
had a
yeah,
case
Marks.
where the chief audit executive made $100,000 a year in his salary and made $900,000 in incentive comp, which was based on the earnings of the company. And towards the back end of the year, they withheld all audit reports, all findings, anything related to the financial statements, because they knew that it affected their his incentive compensation. So and this goes on day after day after day after day.
Oh, it does. And it goes on at a much lower level. I mean, one of the most complex investigations in-house that I ever had to do involved the entire sales team of an entire country, where their incentive compensation was such a huge part of their overall compensation and was dependent on so many really complex calculations and variables that they were able to collectively get together and game the system. So that at the end of the day, and I kind of had sympathy for them in a way, because it was like 70% of their compensation came from meeting these targets. And yet I feel like if they'd applied some of those smarts to actually selling product, they probably would have met their targets. But it was a pretty tough conversation with regional management to say, we've got to terminate your entire sales force and put in place replacements, because these people can't stay in the company. So I think the incentives, I have a big problem with incentive compensation gone wild. It doesn't make sense a lot of the time.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
Just two quick comments. Number one, as much as I am in favor of a good clawback, we have to acknowledge the wrinkle that in some occasions for a company, it will not be in their financial interest to bother with that. I have always been intrigued. I think it was SAP at the beginning of this year. They had an FCPA settlement where they clawed back $109,000 from executives, and they received, I guess, a penalty deduction of $109,000. But does anybody think it really cost them less than $109,000 to fight that with executives in court? Because I suspect if executives want to tie things up, they can. And then quickly, the legal fees might exceed anything that you're going to claw back in hopes of getting some sort of credit with the Justice Department. I don't know, if there's any hard and fast formula for exactly when that will come about, but it's not far-fetched that you might find that there's no incentive for you to claw this back, because it will cost you more in legal fees to do so than you'd get on the upside from doing the right thing by the Justice Department, which the department does acknowledge in its clawback statements and policies. But the other thing I would just say is that I was talking with a lawyer about this just earlier this week, where she had said, if you're clawing back, you're already on the back foot. You're already doing it wrong. The thing to do is somehow withhold. and then it's much easier to keep that and keep people on the straight and narrow for some period than to give everything. And now suddenly you have to fight them to claw it back when they might say, this is stock, it's my property, you can't take it back anymore. And she raised a very good point that this should be much more prospective in the employment agreements you have, as opposed to redrafting like equity plans for the whole company that have to include some sort of compensation or clawback scenarios. That it can be difficult to rewrite partnership agreements, to rewrite equity award plans, focus on withholding things for a period of time rather than clawing them back later. And I thought she raised a pretty good point there.
Yeah, some sort of deferred compensation structure is a good one, but you make a good point, Matt, which is that you have to be careful when you're drafting your clawback policies that they also take into consideration labor laws, because it's not, they can be in conflict with each other as well. I do question though, using the SAP example, 109,000 doesn't sound like it was a whole lot of very senior execs compensation that was clawed back. So you kind of wonder, whether they're using clawback as the right tool at the right level.
That's fair. Yeah.
Well, let me just add that Albemarle clawed back over 750,000. So we've seen higher amounts. Karen Woody, as our knowledgeable person of all things SEC, all things securities, I was really interested in the Flyfish SEC enforcement action. Can you tell us about that?
All right. So the Flyfish enforcement action. I tried for so many years to just bury my head in the sand on all things crypto and NFT, but we're just not going to be able to get away from it. But that's exactly what's happening here. The question is, are NFTs considered securities? And the SEC definitely decided that in the affirmative this week, and I have been saying that for, I think, quite some time. So the issue there is NFT stands for non-fungible token. It's still sort of anyone's guess what they are, but the issue here is whether or not this plan or this investment rose to the level of being considered a security. And just for some background on how we answer that question, the answer is usually found in Section 2A1 of the 1933 Act, which lists all the things that are considered securities, things like debt, stock, notes. That's a long paragraph list of things that count as a security under the code. And one of those enumerated things is an investment contract, which was meant to be kind of this catch-all. This is something. We're not totally sure what, but if it meets the definition of an investment contract, it's a security. What is an investment contract? Well, the court decided that in 1946 in a case called Howey, and so has since been referred to as the Howey test after that case in 1946. That case had to do with oranges and orange groves and selling sections of an orange what would we call that? A big field of orange trees. And out of that, we don't have to go into the details of Howey, but the gist is there are 4 elements that have to be met in order to be deemed an investment contract and therefore a security. It has to be an investment of money with the expectation of profits in some sort of common enterprise where the profit is dependent entirely on the efforts of another, so someone else. So it's I give my money to you and I hope it goes up. That's the idea. And so here we are 80 some years later, and we are considering whether things like crypto, tokens, and now NFTs meet this definition that was established a long time ago. If things end up meeting the definition of an investment contract, they are a security, then they have to be registered before they can be sold. So this is the sort of timeline or the way you walk through the liability here. So we have now enter Flyfish Club. And I just want to I'm going to actually just read a little bit out of the order because it's amazing. So the people who started Flyfish wanted to open a members-only restaurant in New York that was going to be this large space that was going to involve dining, socializing, drinking. It was going to be kind of a club. And the way you got in is you bought an NFT And there were 2 levels of NFT. You could get just the regular one, which gave you access to the restaurant and bar, or you could get the omakase one, which gave you access to this omakase room, which is like high-level sushi or whatever. That's what they were doing there. So, but the greatest thing about this order is, so you have this, okay, here's the setup. The next line in the order says, the Flyfish NFTs are linked to artwork. The regular Flyfish NFTs each linked to the same image of a yellowfish tuna, and the omakase NFTs linked to one of 7 different images of sushi. So, I mean, the jump we get to between those 2 sentences of the order of like, here's the scheme, they're going to buy this thing that gives them access. And then the next sentence about being art, and the thing is a piece of digital art, I think it blows everyone's mind. And I think certainly the people who wrote the Howey opinion, up until really even modern day people, still are scratching their heads about what the heck this is. But basically, it's some sort of thing of value. People can trade. They invest in it and hope that their money goes up. So under the 4 critical elements of this case that was decided 80 years ago, the SEC says, this is a security. You didn't register it. You're getting dinged with a securities violation for this scheme. I I think it's very timely. We're going to see a lot of these. I mean, it does. I think to take the SEC side of this, it smacks of exactly what we were maybe worried about in the 30s and after the 29 crash, where there's all these snake oil salesmen selling whatever, and they claim that is what led to the crash of our markets. So we needed to have instituted in here a registration process, a disclosure process. All that still seems to ring true out of this NFT thing. But I still think we need to get a handle around maybe more modern understandings or modern rules about how we move forward and keep, handling these new pop-up ideas. So, I mean, it's not the first time we've seen NFTs being considered in the realm of securities. Just last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, the DOJ brought an insider trading case against someone who was basically front-running the market for NFTs. Of course, they didn't go as far as say this was a security. They dinged it under mail-in wire fraud as opposed to insider trading, using that as in relation to a trade or, of a security. But you see them, getting close to the line of this is something of value. We don't really know. You're setting up some sort of market here. So we'd seen that just last, I guess it was last August in the Chastain case. So this isn't shocking that the SEC is reading it this way. And we saw, of course, the same thing with various crypto tokens. But, it's a brave new world is all I have to say about that.
So, Karen, in my opinion, Chairman Gensler has very strong opinions on both this and crypto. Is it conceivable that if there was a change in either the SEC or an administration change that had a different philosophy, that it could equally go the other way?
Well, our former president just this week launched his own form of crypto. So I can imagine if his administration comes back into power, we would have a very pro. He's even touted with that as he will be the crypto president. So yes, I think is the short answer to that. I think the rest, I mean, I don't know. It's funny, you read this story and this enforcement action, and what is it about crypto that we all have a knee-jerk reaction to who we think, what the type of people involved in this, which is not fair. Maybe maybe these are really entrepreneurial folks, but man, it does sort of seem like there's a lot of shadiness, sketchiness, getting around various other sorts of regulation in this space. So the answer is, I think whichever way this election comes out will very much dictate the policy and regulations around this.
If someone were going to look at the Howey test and maybe bring it up to date or update it after 80 years, could that be through SEC rulemaking? Would it have to be another court case? Could Congress step in? How would a change actually be evaluated and made?
Yeah, and I guess we still are the foundational sort of bedrock of this is still Howey, but there have been recent crypto cases in front of the SEC where they, relying on Howey, have come out that way about certain DAO-based tokens and situations. So there is more recent precedent on exactly this, and in fact, this order, the SEC cites Howey and says, and its progeny, including things that are referenced in this commission report on, what is about DAO, and that was in 2017. So this is not solely based on this 1946 case, but that is still sort of the genesis of where this all comes from. But there have been more recent ideas. In terms of how you would really lock it in, yeah, I mean, obviously congressional activity would be, I think, the strongest way to have some parameters around this, but we'll see that not in our lifetime. So yeah, maybe the SEC moving. We now have a court that doesn't agree with any major administrative regulations for the most part. So I don't know how effective that would be, because of course that would be challenged in court. So I know I'm a little bit of Debbie Downer about it, but I don't know is the answer of how we really get our arms around it.
All right, Mr. Marks, I asked you to look at PwC's fine in China over the Evergrande audit, and more importantly, what it might mean for internal audit going forward. What did you come up with for us?
Well, before I get into this, I just have to make a disclosure, since I am a principal at BDO, that these are just my personal opinions and not that of BDO's. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. I sound like Jonathan Armstrong, but I gotta make sure I get that out there. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, China's always been interesting, to me, but this $60+ million fine over its audit failures in relation to Evergrande, I do believe could have broader implications for US auditors and other international firms for that matter. The action, when I looked at it, it is, I think it's the most severe yet against a global audit firm by Chinese regulators, if I'm not mistaken. But it does highlight the tightening of regulatory oversight in China, which, we've seen that over the years, especially in industries tied to high levels of debt and financial risks like real estate markets and the like. So for US auditors, this case signals a growing need for stricter adherence, at least I believe, to local regulations when auditing Chinese and other foreign entities. Increased scrutiny across cross-border type auditing practices, especially in high-risk sectors, like I said, and it could lead to more comprehensive due diligence requirements and actually closer collaboration with local regulators to ensure compliance. Before I get into some of my other commentary, the one big thing, like if you were going to gravitate and levitate up to 40,000 feet, the thing that I keep seeing in a lot of these is that, when we fundamentally break them down, um, oversight, risk management, and fraud detection. If you look at the firms and you look at these audits, I think it really fundamentally goes back to those three pillars. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens out of all of this. But it also raises concerns about reputational risks for audit firms working in these volatile markets, as even minor lapses, as we've seen in the past, could result in penalties and business restrictions. I think additionally, Chinese regulators have made it clear that they will hold auditors accountable. Here's the accountability coming in for any perceived failure to detect or report financial irregularities, which again may prompt U.S. auditors operating internationally to reevaluate their risk management strategies, which is what I just reverted back to before, which was oversight, risk management, and fraud detection. I think that's probably going to wind up happening, and so firms really probably need to reassess at this very moment their engagement protocols, particularly when dealing with entities involved in high-profile cases like Evergrande, to avoid a similar outcome. I don't think anybody wants to get fined, $60+ million. So for auditing firms with global operations, this really does set a precedent for heightened vigilance and could impact how audits of Chinese subsidiaries of U.S. companies are conducted, potentially affecting their ability to sign off on key documents and take on new, clients in China. Um, the immediate regulatory impact on PwC, my alumnus firm, operations in China, is interesting, and there are several long-term insights for U.S. auditors and multinational firms to really consider. And I think I mentioned a lot of them, but just kind of summarizing some of my comments, increased scrutiny over global auditing standards, I think is probably one. The ripple effect, certainly reputational risks, which is something that I mentioned. The impact on audit procedures and technology. I think, auditors have tried over the years to implement technology, into the auditing practices. And I think that this is probably something that we'll take a good harder look at as a profession overall, and how to implement to adopt, those advanced auditing technologies, including possibly using artificial intelligence and even data analytics, which I know is sort of they kind of everyone always throws data analytics out there, but I don't think anybody really understands it. And all this again to, in my opinion, to improve oversight and ensure that they could actually detect these red flags more effectively. So, I think there's a couple of key messages in here. I hopefully I've articulated them clearly enough. I don't have the solution for this, except that, it's tough to do an audit to begin with, and then, doing one, a global audit, especially one that involves China, just makes it that much more difficult.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Jonathan?
I mean, just, I suppose, a broader comment. I have been intrigued. I do think one of the longer running plot lines about global audit and risk management challenges is that China is driving a lot of Western businesses away, frankly, sometimes by direct action, like telling PwC, we're going to give you a large fine by Chinese standards, and I thought not allow them to do audits in China for some period of a couple of months. But you will see now a lot of law firms that have retreated from China, partly because I think there's some financial incentives there. They want to focus on more lucrative things. But there's audit firms, there's advisory firms, there's law firms, there's M&A firms, all of which really don't like doing business in China right now, because China has never been an easy place to do business. The economy is not great. And there's always the political factor that if you raise the wrong issue with the wrong politically connected client, you could put your firm in a very difficult spot. I kind of wonder, with a large firm that was politically important, like Evergrande, which kept the economy going in China for a long time while it was actually stable, if you raised fraud issues of a politically important company early, yeah, really? Do you think Beijing is going to love that? So I'm fascinated to see a lot of Western businesses taking 3 or 4 big steps back from China, because it is no longer a market where the juice is worth the squeeze. And I don't know, I doubt PwC would ever reach that conclusion, but a lot of other smaller businesses are, and it's just quite striking.
Jonathan, what do you think this does for people who want to evaluate Chinese businesses? Does it put it more in the dark? Is it going to keep China domestically focused and out of the world market, or are those concerns overblown?
I don't know that they're overblown. I just think that, again, I mean, it's a matter of understanding what the risks are. I mean, sometimes it's really interesting. Taking Take a look at Evergrande, for example, one of China's largest property developers. It's been around for a while. It became a giant in the real estate sector, responsible for building large scale residential properties. I think I'm right on that. I can't remember everything. But you know, their rapid expansion came with heavy reliance on debt. I think that if you're talking about doing business in and around China, or has anything related to that, I think you really need to understand, when we talk about building a compliance program, we talk about understanding the culture. And I think a lot of people that get into business in China really don't understand the culture there. They don't understand the risks. So I think this is one of those things where everything has to be evaluated on a one-on-one basis. I don't, whether they're pushing people or businesses away, I don't really know that that's true or false. Whether people are not going to do business with China, I don't know that that's really possible. For everybody, maybe some people. So to me, it's going to be interesting. Um, I don't, you know, I don't. Again, I don't have all the answers, but I do think this goes back to some of the things that we were talking about, even with the third party stuff, and that is, you know, doing due diligence, really understanding, what the nature of certain things are, and like I said, having that hybrid approach, I think, is one of those things where It's something that I came up with years and years ago when looking at third party risks, especially from a sponsor perspective. I think it really could apply here as well.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now off to our fan favorites, shout outs, and rants. We'll keep the same order. So, Matt, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
Well, I have something. I'm not quite sure how to characterize this because this is somewhat sad in that I wanted to note the early and untimely death of Michaela DePrince, a 29 years old ballerina. And what had struck me, she died under circumstances that have not been disclosed earlier this week. She passed away. What struck me was her tremendous ability to overcome adversity. For those who are not familiar with her, she was born in Sierra Leone during its Civil War strife. Before the age of 5, witnessed her father get murdered, her mother die of starvation, several siblings who also died, was put up for adoption. And then she was basically ostracized at her adoption agency because she had that skin disease, vitiglio, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, where you have this mottled skin color. And so the orphanage officials there didn't like her. And she went through all of this when she was still not even of school age. Immigrated to the United States. She was adopted here along with one of her orphanage friends. They wound up being adoptive sisters in Philadelphia, where she became an incredibly successful and talented ballerina. She worked here in Boston for a while, and she worked in New York. She was on a Beyonce album. Don't ask me what Beyonce song, because I don't know that, but I know triumph over adversity when I see it. And she had delivered that in spades. And it is a sad, sad thing that she has passed away so early. And we should just call out her triumphs while she was here. That's all I have to say this week.
Karen Moore, do you have a shout out and or rant for us? You're on mute, Karen.
Yeah, a shout out with a happier ending, Matt, than yours. But just sending out thoughts and prayers for Nick Gallo, who's the co-CEO at Ethico and one of the just great people in our space, who was in a horrific car accident on Wednesday, is lying in a hospital bed, and 2 days later still manages to send out a LinkedIn post with thoughts and teachings and learnings and how lucky he feels not to be fully paralyzed. So just an outstanding person. If anybody can get through something like this, it's going to be Nick. So just sending out every possible good thought for recovery.
Karen Woody, do you have a shout out and or rant
I
for
echo
us?
that. I send thoughts to Nick. My shout outs, there are a lot of things to rant about this week, but I figure we have many weeks to go. But I'm going to shout out. I'm going to shout out in one of my usual ones, which is in pop culture. So this week the Emmys happened, and I just want to note that I had a shout out to Hacks a number of weeks ago, but it was the episode that didn't get recorded for some reason. So I know everyone who's listening now thinks I'm making this up, but it's true. I called the Hacks win. They won the Emmys on Sunday. Or for whatever category, I guess comedy. And so my current shout out, even though I know those of you who are aware of this show are very aware because it's now in its 4th season, but my shout out and future Emmy predictor, since I seem to be a bit of a kingmaker here, is Slow Horses. It's on Apple TV. It's great. It's got Kristen Scott Thomas, Gary Oldman, and it's about spies. So everything that we love. That's my shout out and my tip.
Excellent show.
Jonathan Marks, shout out and or rant today. I actually have 2 shout outs, so it's kind of interesting. I'm a fraud guy by nature, but this is a personal thing for me, so it's a shout out to eBay. I actually bought something on eBay that required it to be authenticated, and the authenticator found something that they did not like, and they actually sent it back to the seller and said that you should not have advertised it as such. And I was absolutely so impressed by that I actually spent some time and penned a letter to them thanking them for protecting me. So anybody out there that's looking to buy something that is a little bit more out of the norm on eBay and they have an authentication process, it actually does work. So a huge shout out to them. I thought it was fantastic. And then the other thing was I learned of this. Does everybody here know what the keeper test is? So Netflix has this thing which I learned about. It's not, we're not talking about shows now, but they have this keeper test that Netflix uses, and it's around one core question. If your team member told you they were leaving for another job, would you fight to keep them? And I started scratching my head and going, wow, this is interesting. However, while it's the main question, it implicitly leads to other considerations that I think, we really must evaluate. Like, is the employee consistently delivering high quality work and things like that? And they actually have robust severance packages because their theory is that, they want to keep the best people that fit within the organization. And I learned about this yesterday. I bumped into it by accident. And I keep thinking about this. And so I'll probably have more to say later. But I just think it's absolutely fascinating that somebody came up with this keeper test. And for the longest time, I've never even heard of it. And now that I've heard of it, I just find it very intriguing that that's how they're going about sort of creating their culture at Netflix.
I am going to shout out to Los Angeles Dodgers Shohei Ohtani. He had a game for the ages in baseball yesterday. Here were his stats: 6 for 6, 3 home runs, 10 RBIs, and the creme de la creme, 2 stolen bases to make him the first person to create the 50-50 club. What is the 50-50 club? 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases in one season. Never been done before. It was, the last homer may have been fluff, but if it goes out of the stadium, I count it as a homer. The best day of baseball I'd ever heard of before this was the end of the 1941 season when Ted Williams, with a 399.7 batting average, said, no, I'm going to play. But he played a doubleheader. And a doubleheader, he went 6 for 8 and went to 406 for the last 400 hitter. But this game yesterday was something special. Ohtani is something special. And if you love special baseball, he gave us a gift for the ages yesterday.
Yes, he did.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. This was a great episode. I can't wait to see what we come up with next time.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Tom.
Okay, we're off recording. Great job, guys. Wow.
The fucking keeper test. Jesus. Did you? I'm like, you got to be joking me. Like, this really exists and they do this? Apparently they do. Like,
Yeah.
I want to find out more. I was doing research yesterday on something for a client, because they're having these huge governance issues. And I'm like, well, how are you hiring your people and whatever? And I started going to, all of a ssudden, this guy starts writing about Netflix. And now they have this. I'm like, what? And then I'm like, no. This is a joke, right? It's not a joke. Apparently it's real. So I know nothing about it except for what I told you.
It sounds discriminatory, like, frat party popularity contest.
I don't know.